Hi, everybody. I'm Sue Cross. So I heard great, inspiring stories yesterday, and I think we'll hear more today. And what I'm going to talk about is all the funding behind that and the numbers behind that. Vince had asked me to kind of give you the nuts and bolts, what we see, a picture of the overall field, as well as tips on how to fund small newsrooms at scale, because we know that's a challenge in philanthropy. So this is going to go at lightning speed and kind of be two lightning talks mushed together here. But these are really the numbers and the overall trend behind this incredible journalism we're hearing about. We're focusing on small newsrooms because in many ways they are leading the reinvention of journalism. You can see great impact from funding them, and there are practical, efficient ways to fund them at scale, manage risk, and really build a new future. The overall field, there are now 400, more than 400, there'll be closer to 500 by the end of the year, nonprofit newsrooms across the United States. They now have more than 4,000 journalists in them, and they have a particular kind of impact in the journalism they are doing. They are focused on original reporting. Their selection of coverage is based on civic, public value, public service rather than profit. They have a multiplier effect. These 400 newsrooms are providing content that goes to more than 7,000 other news media. So they are really supporting for-profit as well as nonprofit and in all formats. They're highly entrepreneurial, community builders. They are really finding new ways to engage and serve communities in most actually, in communities that have not been well served by traditional media that's based on ad revenue. So they're leading this movement to reimagine journalism as a shared service. It is often running in the United States. These models are now being followed around the world as well. And they're getting more community building, more equitable access to knowledge and power, and deeper knowledge out there to battle disinformation and key topics. So essentially, those are the ends, they're the means. Sorry, I'm working off two documents here. INN is growing this field through a network strategy. We build the network and with the community agree on standards around original reporting, around transparency that can build public trust. We provide the capacity building and shared services that are changing the economics of news in this kind of a network. And they're significantly more inclusive in providing news as a public service in many more types of communities. We also provide the framework so they can operate as a mutual aid network and strong peer community as well. The strategy around this network goes beyond directly serving journalists. We help funders find and support many strong newsrooms. We help many communities and civic leaders figure out how to reinvent news or save it where they have it. The growth we're seeing and generating is represented here. INN works with 50 to 100 news startups a year or the community leaders behind them, and many of them we may start incubating for up to 2 years before they launch. We are increasingly seeing civic leaders lead that effort right alongside journalists or even before journalists. The surge now is in local newsrooms forming as nonprofits, but you're also continuing to see growth in in-depth accountability, investigative journalism, particularly at those state and national levels. The growth is coming from creating an ecosystem, an environment for success where that whole network can grow, and it's really working. We see very strong success metrics. We see more than 90% survival rates. We have been tracking that for now close to 15 years, and it's maintained. We see that 70% have 3 or more revenue sources. So people worry, are startups risky? Will they fail? They're able to diversify revenue, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, very quickly, from philanthropic startup funding. And that gives them a resilience in what they do. They also are networked, so even though they're small newsrooms, they tend to actually be pretty highly efficient. They have low operating costs. They share a lot of services. Had we looked at this pie 10 years ago, the blue of foundations up at the top would have been filled almost the whole circle. But now, foundations are actually building this stronger base underneath. You, through foundation funding, are creating much more long-term viability. So we know that most startups depend on foundation funding, at least in part, to get launched. But we now have the data to see that it takes them 3 to 5 years in most communities. There's variance, but overall, 3 to 5 years, they're able to leverage traditional philanthropic foundation grants and build other sustainable revenue streams. So that's what's fueling this kind of strong journalism, the community connections, and innovation in how journalism is reframing itself as a public good. And that leads us to our practical tips. So to support the momentum of small news outlets, we know that can raise particular challenges, and there are 4 ways you can really effectively fund small news. We're going to talk about how to get the most leverage out of your grants, the power of seed funding, setting a sustainable plate for long-lasting impact versus short-term, and looking forward for your metrics and measures of impact rather than back at the industry of the future. So I'll run through these pretty quickly. This is Newsmatch. We see the amazing power if we can leverage national grants through Newsmatch. Many of you are familiar with it. Many of you support it. It's a coalition of about 15 national funders and hundreds of local funders now that put up a national pool to ignite local and individual support for news. So this is really the end game in our local news challenge, if you think about it. Leverage every grant to help build broader and more diverse local support. So the idea is simple. It's a match. Newsmatch at the end of each year. It's a national campaign. It's a national wave of capacity building to build long-term ability to do this. And then the national pool and local pools match dollar for dollar, sometimes at double or triple dollars, individual gifts to news outlets. It also can be highly targeted by region, a state, or a specific topic. We have leveraged funding to support newsrooms committed to covering health, covering climate, social justice, for example. So again, this leveraging, which you also can do, by the way, by funding collaborations or coming and seeking help to fund a pool of vetted small news organizations through us or other network organizations in many ways. But the powerful leverage is there to stretch funding to the thousands of local news outlets we know we need across the country. The other secret in this is, and I hear the anxiety, oh my God, we need thousands more of these. How do we scale this? How do we stretch journalism funding to cover it? We do need more startups, a lot more startups, hundreds of more startups, to replace the coverage that is being lost and to bring news back to communities that have lost it. You can do this. I really encourage you to put money in seed funding to fund startups sooner. I think from those stats, it may not be as risky as you or your board think it is, but even if funding startups or innovation is not your main portfolio strategy, and we get that, I would encourage you to think about, can you carve out 10% of your portfolio to fund experiments, fund innovation, fund startups, because that is what is now reshaping the future, and you can have huge impact in that. I also encourage you to specifically, in all kinds of grants, fund equity and inclusion practices. Include that in every grant. Make it specified. Larger nonprofits are making great headway. Nonprofit news looks considerably different in a good way compared to the traditional media I grew up in and most of us did. But smaller newsrooms need not just training, they need the funds to act on it. So we need your partnership in changing the field from within. And I encourage you to include that as part of your thinking about innovation and reshaping journalism. The second thing, newsrooms cannot live on project grants alone. Don't starve them. Give them a full meal. They can't live on that little rice bowl. And especially if you are trying to fund to do narrative change or project funding, we understand those goals, but at this point in time, unless you are funding the operations around it and enabling them to continue, we won't have newsrooms to do those projects, do that narrative change. So really, I know nonprofits have been asking for GenOps funding since nonprofits began, but at this point in time in journalism, it is particularly important. We see it create these newsrooms that can do this project work. When you are doing project funding, I encourage you, don't just fund the reporting. Make sure your grantees aren't just lowballing the project cost. Fund the web software so they can get that reporting to the public, the editor, the media liability insurance. Otherwise, what we can see is project funding can actually weaken their ability to tell stories and serve those communities over time. Finally, looking forward for impact, and you have heard bits of this from Crystal, from Tracy. Most of us here are rooted in some way in traditional news, either as consumers. We grew up with newspapers. We grew up with commercial broadcasts. We love it. In my case, I do. But it's not what the future looks like. And that is so exciting and so promising that these new forms are coming about. And it's really part of much broader change in community building and cultural change overall, and the changes in philanthropy toward trust-based grant making. The most powerful force in journalism right now is community. It's communities supporting these new kinds of news. So let the communities lead. Let them define the metrics of success, and then you can hold your grantees accountable to meeting those measures of success, but let the communities they serve work with them to determine what that looks like in each place or on each topic. And these measures and metrics are really changing. They aren't the total audience UVs of the past, the size of the audience, their engagement, involvement. They can take years to see the change develop in a community. But this innovation pouring out is actually creating a new future. And it's that innovation and experimentation that I encourage you, count that as one of your impacts. Did this grant enable them to try something new? Not all of it will work. That's okay. A lot of it will, and that's where we're seeing really promising developments. So it's your support enabling that change, led by small newsrooms, and we really thank you for that and for enabling this kind of growth. So let us know how we can help. I'm here the rest of the day, and we are always available. Thank you.